Okay, so my name's Susan Cake. I'm the Director of Policy Analysis at the Alberta Federation of Labour, so I'll be your moderator today. So this session in general, we're going to look at some of the policy fixes around our labour market and see if those fixes are actually translating into the outcomes that we would like. And so our speakers are going to be focusing on a couple different areas. Our first speaker is going to be Jason Foster. So Jason is an Assistant Professor of Human Resources and Labour Relations at Athabasca University. His research there focuses on workplace injury, migrant workers and union renewal, and he is the author of Defying Expectations, the case of UFCW Local 401, and the co-author of Health and Safety in Canadian Workplaces. So he'll be our first speaker today. And then our second speaker is going to be Andrew Jackson. So Andrew spent most of his career as the Chief Economist and Director of Social and Economic Policy with the Canadian Labour Congress. And since retiring from the CLC back in 2012, he's been a Senior Policy Advisor at the Broadbent Institute, and he spent 2 years as the Packer Visiting Professor of Social Justice at York University and is currently an Adjunct Research Professor at Carleton University. He does a number of writing as well, so he has a bi-weekly online column for the Globe and Mail and is the author of a number of articles and several books, including Work and Labour in Canada, Critical Issues, which is now in its third edition. So without further ado, please welcome our first speaker, Jason.
Thanks, Susan, and thank you everyone for getting up on a Saturday morning to come and get depressed about the state of the labour market. That's, I think, what I'm going to do to you. But don't worry, I'm going to try and be hopeful at the end, so you'll just have to endure a short-term depression, and then hopefully things get better. Everyone in the back can hear okay with the microphone? It's a little echoey, but it's good. Okay. So, as often happens in our social media-laden world, we get inundated with news and stories and issues. One day it might be a story about Uber and its nefarious labor practices. The next day we'll read a news story about stagnating wages. The week after that it might be a report about youth unemployment and their struggles in the labor market. And then later in the month you might hear about employer abuses of temporary foreign workers. These stories just keep coming at us. But I think because they just keep coming and we keep getting distracted by other stories that also come down the pike, we don't stop to just sort of take a look at all of them and get ourselves a sense of the big picture. And so that's kind of what I want to do today, is to try and sort of point to sort of the broader structural things going on in the labor market, why it might be going wrong and what we can do about it. I imagine the individual pieces that I'm going to talk about in the next little bit are all going to be very familiar to you, but it's about putting them in one place and being able to put our gaze upon them at one time. Or not. There we go. So, since the election of the NDP in 2015 here in Alberta, we've seen significant shift in employment policy, and in particular policy that's favoring workers. Improvements to employment standards, so including things like expansion of unpaid leaves. We've seen changes to the labor code that improve the prospects of workers who actually want to join a union actually getting a union. Work rights for farm workers. We know that there's changes to the WCB coming, as well as occupational health and safety. But probably the highest profile change that the NDP government's made in its first 2.5 years is the commitment to a $15 minimum wage, which will take effect in October of next year. So, here's a little chart about minimum wages. The vertical line is the 2015 election. Basically, I want to just show you this chart to show you that raising the minimum wage works. So, basically, in the period before the NDP was elected, the minimum wage, so the top line, the green line, is the actual wage, is what it was, and then what I did is I adjusted for inflation with the orange line. And essentially it was flat, starting to rise a little bit in the last few years as even the Conservatives started to realize their minimum wage policies were too harsh. And then we see this big uptick. So they're increasing the wage $4.80 in 3 years. After inflation, that works out to be about $3 an hour after you factor in inflation. That is not an insignificant wage increase for people who are our lowest income workers in the country. Estimates are there are about 300,000 Albertans who are currently earning less than $15 an hour. So every single one of them is going to get a pay raise by October 2018. And if past experiences with minimum wage increases will plays through, we know that many workers in the $15 to $17 range who currently are earning that amount will also get a pay hike, just to sort of keep that margins going up. And so that means hundreds of thousands of Albertans are going to get tangible wage increases. And better yet, the Alberta government's commitment to $15 minimum wage has prompted or prodded Ontario and BC to follow suit with similar promises. And I start with minimum wage because I actually believe it's good policy. It works by directly regulating the minimum price of labor, and it targets workers who most need government support in bolstering their economic prospects. And I want to come back to this. But what I want to also say is that if this is all we do, raise the minimum wage, tinker around the edges of the Employment Standards Act, and things like that, we'll be done very little to repair the structural problems plaguing the labor market, hence the name of my talk. So be warned, here comes the depressing bit. Neoliberal policies since the 1980s, and as Linda McQuaig, I think, so eloquently talked about last night, since at least the 1980s and 1990s, they've slowly eaten away like termites at the pillars of the labor market. Maybe termites is the wrong phrase because it kind of came at us more in waves. So waves of termites eating away at the wood pillars of the labor market. And we'll talk about the causes of this, the eroding away of the pillars in a minute. But first I want to give you a quick overview of the state of the labor market today. In particular, 4 elements that I want to highlight a little bit. First is stagnating wages. Under capitalism, wages are primarily driven by market forces, and so therefore are a reflection of workers' bargaining power, broadly speaking, in that market. It's no surprise that in the post-war Fordist era, as Linda talked about last night, workers' share of the economy increased, as she talked about, evidenced by growing wages. And it should be noted the creation of a stable middle class. In a sign of weakening bargaining power, wages have been basically stagnant for over 25 years. According to Statistics Canada, the average hourly wage adjusted for inflation in 1977 was $24 an hour. And last year in 2016, it was $27.70 an hour, about a 15% increase over almost 30 years. Inflation-adjusted GDP has more than doubled, almost tripled in that time. Workers are not capturing, in the last 25, 30 years, they have not been capturing their share of economic growth. And what, of course, even these averages hide is that the share of the income across the population, higher incomes on the top mask the hollowing out in the middle, which I don't think I need to go into detail about because, again, Linda did an excellent job last night, for those of you who were there, of describing that process. Second is the growth in precarious work. Stability of employment is also a measure of worker bargaining power. You'll start to get, maybe that might be a theme in my talk today. Workers, when they have more bargaining power, are able to exact longer-term commitments from their employer in return for their labor. So precarious work is just work lacking all the stability of what we look for in a good job. So it's part-time work, temporary, term contracts, insecure hours, multiple jobs, sole self-employment, and so on. It's basically the removal of the long-term promise of a relationship with the employer. It's estimated today that between 25 and 30% of all jobs, depending on exactly how you calculate it, can be classified as precarious. And while that fluxes somewhat with the economic cycle, the trend over the last 20 years has clearly been upward. And of course, we have to remember that precarity is not evenly distributed, right? Women, youth, Indigenous workers, immigrants, racialized workers are all more likely to be in precarious employment than essentially white men. And then the third depressing fact is the growth of migrant labor. And this is a complex issue. But migrant labor generally are a desirable source of labor for employers because they're vulnerable, they're dependent upon the employer, they lack the same mobility rights as Canadian workers, and so therefore are more compliant. In the early 2000s, significant policy changes at the federal level shifted a lot of our policy away from permanent immigration, which had been the dominant policy for most of the last 50 years, to that of temporary migrant labor. Before the changes, there were about 90,000 workers, temporary foreign workers in Canada, mostly high-skilled, rare professions, those kinds of things. Last year, there were 340,000. A good chunk of those, a significant amount of that growth is in lower-skilled workers. And that's even down from the peak of 2014 due to the recession of the last couple of years. As I say, most of the growth in that whole period of time and most of that big growth between 90 and 350,000 are low-skilled workers. So as I say, this is a complex issue for me because I study migrant workers extensively in my research, and I understand their experiences, their aspirations. They're very strong people. They're men and women who are very determined. But the net effect of their influx, and this is not to blame them as workers, they are legitimately coming here in hopes of bettering their lives. But the net effect is that their influx is that they expand the available labor pool and become a preferred option for employers. A study that I did with my colleague Bob Barnettson, looking at the construction sector in Alberta, found that the influx of temporary foreign workers by employers basically pushed out women, youth, and immigrants and Aboriginal workers, leaving them on the margins of the construction labor pool, while temporary foreign workers were used as what we call a hyper-flexible source. And so they would sort of bring them in big masses, and then when they didn't need them anymore, away they went, right? And so as a result, they allow employers to be able to kind of fiddle around with the nature of their labor pool. The fourth is what I'm going to call the rise of the Uber economy. Some people call it sometimes the gig economy or the quote sharing economy, which is a bit of an oxymoron. I'm going to call it the Uber economy because the gig economy is a little broader than what I'm talking about, and I think Andrew Cash tomorrow will be talking more extensively about the gig economy. So many people that this is just an extension of precarious work, but I actually argue that this part of the economy is different because it completely erases the employment relationship and takes the element of the lack of commitment to workers on the behalf of employers, on the part of employers, to new lengths. So an analogy might be that if the standard employment relationship, permanent full-time employment, is a marriage, and precarious work is like casual dating, then the Uber economy is speed dating. And so part of it is technology. Part of it is the capacity of organizations like Uber, and there's lots of these apps out there now. By clicking on an app, you can get a car ride, you can get someone to clean your house, you can get a handyman, you can get food brought to your door, all just by clicking on an app and having no associations of who that person actually works for. So technology has been disrupting these elements of employment. What used to be a more traditional direct line between service provider, worker, and client and customer has now been broken up into pieces by the technology. But it's not just the technology, though. We're seeing the similar elements of technology, whether it be home working, whether it be the abilities of doing sort of micro-contracting out, where workers will online bid for little bits of programming work that takes maybe minutes, and they get paid cents in order to do it, and they'll do that hundreds of times a day in order to try and keep their work going. And so what employers in this sector of the economy are doing is that they have been able to effectively jettison the obligations that come with being an employer while maintaining the same kind of control over their labor force as an employer has. An Uber driver has to follow a long list of operating procedures lest they get fired by Uber. Although they don't say they're fire them, they just lock them out of the app. Right? But they have a great deal of control over these workers without any kind of commensurate responsibilities. So the significance, I think, of this economy is that they're not just skirting the employment rules or using loopholes like employers have done for centuries. They're actually digging a tunnel underneath the whole labor market regulation regime. It's hard to know exactly how many workers are stuck in this situation. We do know that Uber brags that it has 22,000 drivers across the country and growing. So we can imagine that these numbers, if we start extrapolating to other apps and to other sort of platforms, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers across the economy. How's that picture? What I want to now argue, having given you all these individual pieces in one place, is I want to argue that all of them are the symptoms of a single cause with multiple components within it. And essentially that is the erosion of Canada's labour market institutions. And it is this reality that I think we miss when we focus on the individual stories that come crossing our Facebook feeds or across our newspapers or our news programs. Labor market institutions, to get all academic-y on you for a quick second, are the sets of programs and policies that build a structure for the labor market. They set the boundaries, the floors, and the staircases for the building that is our labor market. And I say staircases because it's not just about building floors and protecting workers' main rights. It's also about giving them opportunity to be able to step up the labor market ladder. And so in Canada, we make up 5 components. And I want to just briefly go through the 5 components and show the state that they're in, so that then we can identify the problem clearly that allows us to maybe talk about solutions. So the first is the minimum wage. It's an institution because it fixes a floor. It sets a floor price for labor, and so it makes it clear to employers what they can and cannot do. Over the past 30 years, the purchasing power of the minimum wage has eroded. Stats Canada once again says, factoring in for inflation, the value of the minimum wage peaked in 1976, declined through the 80s and 90s, first part of the 2000s, and has started to creep back up in the past decade. But we have not yet reached the 1976 level. So 30-some years later, minimum wage workers are earning less than what they did 30 years ago. 40, thank you. I can't add. I have a social sciences degree. The second is employment regulation, employment standards, codes, health and safety codes, those kinds of things. They create, again, they also are kind of a floor. They're a minimum expectation of what will be included in an employment contract. You're all familiar with the rules, I can imagine, because most of you work, and even those of you who don't will have an understanding of how this works. This is basically creating a minimum floor outside of wages and talking about working conditions. The actual rules around employment have remained fairly static, and you could even maybe argue have improved over the last 30 years. But 2 things have undercut their effectiveness. First is a lack of enforcement. For example, here in Alberta, in occupational health and safety, last year there were 7,600 inspections of workplaces. Sounds kind of impressive, except you find out that that only affects less than 2% of all employers in the province of Alberta. So that means 98% of employers never saw an enforcement officer, no matter what they were doing. And out of all of those 7,600 inspections, only 12 employers were charged with violations of the code. And so it's a passive, complaint-driven system as well, so we don't have enough of it, and it's kind of got a model where they don't actively go out and try and pursue wrongdoers. So again, using Alberta, in employment standards, there were about 5,800 complaints filed to employment standards officers last year. Of those, only 680 were actually initiated by employment standards officers themselves. The rest, they were relying upon workers and citizens to phone their hotline and say, I'm seeing a violation. So you can imagine already what the problem is there. You have to have a lot of security, not be afraid of your employer, and not being afraid of being reprised to be able to complain that you haven't been paid your wages properly. And the second problem is it's not keeping up with the shifting nature of the economy. This rise of precarious work, dependent self-employment, contracting out, none of that is handled by existing legislation. The existing legislation assumes the standard employment relationship that got set up in the 1950s and has not changed since. And so as a result, huge chunks of workers in the economy go completely unregulated by employment regulations. Third is income security. And so this is again the set of policies that ensure workers have some access to income supports outside of employment. So this includes employment insurance, welfare programs, pensions, WCB, but it can also include other kinds of things, right? The family bonus used to be one, child benefits. There's lots of ways in which you put cash in workers' pockets so that they don't have to rely exclusively upon the market, or that if they lose their job, they've got something they can fall back to. That's the purpose of it. And again, surprise, surprise, that has eroded over the last 25 years. Successive changes to employment insurance have essentially restricted access to EI and punishes precisely the workers that need it the most. Part-time workers, seasonal workers, workers who tend to be unemployed more frequently, people who need it. To these days, less than 30% of unemployed workers receive employment insurance. This is down from over 80% in the 1980s. So So that is no longer an effective income security net for workers when only less than 1 in 3 get access to it. Welfare rates have always been low. In every province, they've always been low, and they've just been declining when you factor in inflation across every province. WCB and pensions have been more stable, but we still lag other countries in terms of what we provide. And as private pensions become increasingly under attack, we're not filling the gap with public pensions. Another benefits, of course, are spotty. It depends on the government, depends on the day, depends on who you are. But overall, the discouraging trend has been to erode what we do provide. And even there's really one of the disturbing trends is that not only governments don't want to actually give cash to workers anymore, right? They want to give them tax credits. So you have to file your tax return, and maybe when you get your tax return back, you'll get a little bit of cash. It doesn't help you the remaining 11 months of the year when you actually could use that money. The fourth pillar is labor market coordination. These are policies around training, around support for workers in acquiring new skills, making occupational transitions, making decisions about where do we need to move our labor force so that it can fit the changing economy. Quite frankly, Canada has always sucked at this piece of the puzzle. We've never been good at it. And the problem is, in the last decade or so, we've just stopped doing it altogether. The amount of market training supported by the government has been eroding, and that's almost virtually non-existent these days. And then the final pillar is the labor movement. And while that's not a government policy, it's not a government thing, it's still very much a labor market institution. It's because they serve a crucial role in burgeoning up worker bargaining power. And not just the workers of their members, not just the people who've joined a union and are represented by a union in their workplace. If a labor movement is strong enough, their effect can go across the sector, can go across the economy in supporting workers. Now, when we look down at the United States, where the labor movement's been being decimated, it might be fairly easy for us to go, phew, that's not us. Unfortunately, and it's true, we've been in slow decline. We still have a unionization rate of about 30%, which sounds not half bad. In 1981, we were at 38%. So it shows you we're losing some ground, but it doesn't seem that bad. Except, you start breaking in those numbers, part of it is that our unionization rates have been buttressed by the public sector. Private sector unionization is about 15% in Canada. Still double of the United States, but a very, very low number. That's a number where unions cannot have this broader effect for workers across a sector. Instead, the best they can do is fight back against attacks against their own members and to try and hold up their own member situation. Worse is that unionization is lowest in the fastest growing sectors of the economy. Finance, retail services, high tech. The workers who most need unions are the least likely to get unions. So that means, again, racialized workers, young workers, indigenous workers, immigrants are all less likely to be in a union than other Canadians. And so, unfortunately, the direction of the labor movement at the moment is in a slow decline, the slow sort of erosion of its ability to be able to buttress workers' bargaining power also has an effect on the nature of the labor market. So let me stop depressing you. So we can see things are bad. The pillars are in rough shape, and if we don't do something soon, they're going to crumble altogether. So what's the solution? And I think it requires cross-dimensional thinking. There's a lot of inspiring campaigns right now. The Fight for 15, groups looking at root causes of poverty, lots of sort of campaigns around pensions and around challenging race and gender. These are all very, very encouraging signs, all very positive campaigns and movements. But what we need to do is we need to find a way to cut across these campaigns and to link them in a broader recognition that we need to increase workers' bargaining power in the economy generally. Which I think means seeing individual issues that we struggle for in a broader context. So yes, let's increase the minimum wage, and let's keep raising it so it keeps up with inflation and gives workers an actual sort of living wage as a base. But doing that is not enough. We also need improvements to EI. We need to strengthen enforcement of existing regulations and modernize those regulations. We need better pensions, other forms of income support, including possibly, he says, looking at Andrew, a guaranteed annual income. He'll be talking about that in a moment. But there's a challenge here. This is a lot to ask of us. It relies us on fostering political change and prodding government action. And I think as the logic of neoliberalism lurches from crisis to crisis in the coming years, there will be increasing opportunities for us to be able to prod that action. But as any kind of political change happens, it's always uneven and it's spotty. And so that means we need to look, if we're going to actually really take advantage of the opening of the neoliberalism's existential crisis, that we need to strengthen the non-governmental institutions of the labor market, which means two things. One, we have to strengthen the labor movement. And that is partly not just about creating better labor laws. That's about rethinking the role of unions in the economy. Rethinking, if you want to reach out to workers who don't have union representation, you can't keep doing things the same way. So we have to challenge the labor movement to find new ways of looking at how it does its job of organizing and representing workers. And then finally, I want to propose we need to create a sixth labor market pillar: alternative forms of work. And what I mean by that is we need to create productive spaces for workers within the traditional labor market, but outside of traditional employers. Worker co-ops, nonprofit community enterprises, trying to find a way to create a true form of a sharing economy where workers can swap skills for mutual gain. It can take a number of forms. These are just ideas. But we haven't spent enough energy in Canada to contemplate how do we make that happen. And I think by creating a sixth pillar, we have the capacity to be able to then also shore up the existing pillars. And so I'll just leave you with that sort of thought, and that maybe tomorrow we can all start to work on looking at new forms of worker engagement.
Everybody hear me okay? So thanks a lot to the Parkland Institute for the invitation to come here. I've certainly followed their work over many years now. I think does a wonderful job of critiquing public policy both in Alberta and nationally. So the theme of my remarks is basic income or decent work, and I certainly build my argument off a lot of the same argument that Jason was putting forward. So what I want to really critique is a universal basic income as the key response to the crisis of neoliberalism. And to define a universal basic income in its most fundamental form, as advocated by Guy Standing, formerly of the International Labour Organization, what they're talking about is paying to every citizen as of right, every adult citizen as of right, an amount that's roughly sufficient to live upon. And there's a number of arguments for that, but it decouples income security from the world of work, essentially, and it's put forward as a response to the neoliberal job market. And you've seen it percolate around, I guess, in the NDP leadership race. Guy Caron embraced the idea of a universal basic income. There's now an experiment in Ontario with basic income. Now, I don't want to get lost in the weeds here, but there are variants of a proposal. Another major thing that differs in detail is instead of paying every adult citizen an amount, you would in the income tax make sure everybody received a certain amount of a threshold income at the end of the day. So you'd be topping up low incomes at the bottom and then phasing them out as people's incomes rose, as opposed to a universal basic income, which you pay people out to people, then it would be added to that taxable income. So there's a kind of bottom up versus a universal approach, but they're pretty much the same in terms of detail. So what I want to argue is that the rise of precarious and low-paid employment, which has been thoroughly documented by Jason, demands fundamental reforms to the labour market and income security programs. But I think a universal basic income is undesirable for technical, philosophical, and political reasons, despite its growing popularity. That said, I think we should embrace the vision of a basic income in the sense of a suite or a number of targeted programs which combined provide a universal citizen guarantee of well-being independent of market income. So the way I look at it, I'll get to this, I guess. But I mean, if seniors, for example, we have the guaranteed income supplement to old age security, which does guarantee an income to every senior. It needs to be increased. But I mean, we have something along the lines of a guaranteed annual income. We have a universal child benefit, phased out with rising income, provides a minimum threshold income for children. Again, not insufficient. I think the key issue is how we deal with working age adults and the big hole in our income security system, low income working age adults. So in thinking about a basic income, we should recall that the idea has origins on both the right and the left. And Milton Friedman back in the 60s actually agreed with John Kenneth Galbraith around pursuing a basic income strategy. But Friedman's vision was that if you gave a basic cash support to every adult, then you could fold all other social programs into it. And Friedman would argue just once everybody had a minimum basic income, you could privatize schools, healthcare, hospitals, and everybody could get access to what they needed through the market. So all you needed to create income security overall was a single cash payment in the context of a thoroughly marketized economy. And I think there is still a danger of it taking us in that direction. But just to acknowledge the progressive vision of a universal basic income, I think is by contrast morally compelling. It aims to break the very tight nexus between the labor market and well-being, which is inherent in a capitalist economy. And it could, in certain forms, replace current welfare programs, which are both inadequate and punitive. But I think there's some serious flaws, which I'll go through, which militate against this approach. So the key problem, or a key problem, the way I see it, is our current income security system is very heavily tilted towards seniors and children, as opposed to working age adults, if you absent support for children. So if you take working age families, and this would include child benefits in the equation, only 5% of the income of working age families comes from government income transfer support programs. So you've got child benefits in there, EI, some social assistance. So that's a number that's quite low and should plausibly be increased in a number of fronts, including EI and welfare reform. But just by contrast, if you paid out a universal basic income to every working age adult in Canada, sufficient to bring them to the poverty line, which would say $20,000 a year, that would actually cost $450 billion, or about 20% of GDP. Now, you can talk about saved administration costs. You can talk about folding in some other programs. I'll get to that. I'd be opposed to that. But you're talking about an enormous increase in taxes or revenues from somewhere to pay out a benefit to everybody, which in many cases would be taxed back. So somebody probably at the average wage on most designs would not be ahead on net terms after a universal basic income, because they'd have to pay higher taxes to finance it somehow. So I think this is quite literally putting all of our eggs in one basket if you carry it through to the ultimate logic. And I guess I'm going to argue there's many other things that we should be doing with the extra government revenues, including a very significant expansion of public services, and not just income support programs. So if you think about, I know it's the right that gets very upset about supposed disincentives to work that arise from income support programs. I don't buy into that, but I do think we have to have a very serious concern about clawbacks from income security programs and how our income security programs interact with the job market. So now in most provinces, I believe Alberta is probably the same. If people moving from welfare to work have, after a very low threshold usually, face losing social assistance benefits almost dollar for dollar as they transition or try to transition from a social assistance receipt to trying to support themselves on a part-time or low-wage jobs. We call that the welfare wall. Under the guaranteed income supplement, seniors who take a part-time job to eke out what is not a particularly generous benefit get taxed back on income at the rate of about 70%. So I don't think we have to worry about a world of a universal basic income in which people get that first $15,000, $20,000 for the state, but then they're probably going to be taking a tax back rate of 50, 60, 70% on employment income beyond that. At least we have to take that issue seriously. And then I think we have to sort of pose the question of John Clark with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, getting the title wrong, has argued this a lot. Why do we think that an electorate who have generally rejected meager welfare benefits for the very poor and improving those would suddenly support a universal basic income paid as of right to everybody with no obligation to work at all, at least as part of Standing's conception? And then I think you come face to face with what some political scientists call the paradox of redistribution, which is this: if you take those countries like the United States that have the most uneven division, the most unequal division of income and wealth, so the share of the top 1% in the US, anyway, Linda threw out those numbers, you'd think in theory should have a redistributive program on the income side to stop the very poor from falling deeply into poverty. So while you've got a few high-tech billionaires calling about a universal basic income as the solution to precarious and low-wage work and poverty, the fact is the right massively rejects income supports for the poor. The politics in the US don't even work for that. Actually, famously in the US, I think it was under Reagan, actually the Republicans were actually part of expanding an earned income tax credit for people on very low incomes. And then the politics of it shifted and the Republican slogan became tax cuts for taxpayers. So there was no way you were going to get an income support program unless you were taxable, contributing to the market and the same. But conversely, if you take those European countries which have the most equal distributions of income from the market economy, the most equal distributions of wages, so Denmark's a good example, Australia to a limited degree given they have a high minimum wage. But it's the countries that are most equal on the basis of the market that it turns out actually spend the most on income support programs for those in need and social support programs. And it does seem to be that relatively equal incomes from the market breed some kind of culture of solidarity and sharing that disappears in highly unequal societies. So just throwing on a universal basic income as a sort of band-aid on inequality generated by the market is politically problematic. So just to throw a bit of jargon at you, there's kind of been an argument on the left for some time that it's not just redistribution that we should be concerned about, but pre-distribution. What is the distribution of income by the capitalist economy in the first place? We should worry about that and then worry about redistribution afterwards. There's another issue, big issue, I think, with a basic income as an anti-poverty strategy. And this is already, it's a sort of relatively minor point, but it's already arising in the Ontario context that there's some concerns now on the part of people on disability benefits. If they participate in the basic income, they might actually end up worse off because they will be expected to pay for some supports and services out of their basic income, which they're now getting as support services under the social assistance program. But more widely, if we were thinking about an anti-poverty strategy, and the federal government is reflecting on this at the moment, I think as part of that we would want to put on the list affordable housing, childcare, so particularly single mothers, single parents can access the labor market. For persons with disability, we'd be talking about income supplements, so people who move in and out of a disability status can participate in the job market without losing their benefits. Certainly supports and services for persons with disabilities. So when you really disentangle the reasons why, the skills training, to name another one, and rightly noted is on your list, which is abysmal. I mean, the kind of strategies to get people out of poverty are much more individualized by need and would not be seriously addressed in all cases just by giving people an additional cash payment. Which would likely, if we don't have a decent childcare system in place, you've got to pay for expensive childcare through the market. An increase in or a universal basic income isn't going to move you too far relative to where you want to be. I guess an additional point is many proponents of universal basic income say, well, of course it's affordable because we'll just throw in all these other programs as part of it. So, and a big candidate on the list is employment insurance, as it's Orwellianly named. The Canada Pension Plan sometimes features on people's lists. But we should reject the idea that the only point of income security programs is to address poverty and low income. So EI performs a very important function in the fact that, more than half of all the use of EI is still for the very classic reason somebody who's been in a stable employment position loses their job, they're out of work for a number of months, they find another job. They're not actually repeat users, contrary to myth. They need a program that supports them through a period of unemployment and job search at a particular time in their lives. So I'm very reluctant to take all spending on income security programs and just folding them into a universal basic income. To make a sort of wider point, I think social progress under capitalism has been furthered not just or even most importantly by transferring and equalizing income to promote broader access to market services, but by taking basic welfare risks outside the market in the form of universal or highly subsidized public and social services. So I do think a basic income, if it eats up so much of the fiscal resources that are potentially at the hand just to pay for an income benefit, is going to foreclose the revenues that we need to establish a universal affordable childcare program, to invest in an affordable housing program, disability supports and services. The list goes on. I think there's another problem that's not given sufficient attention, which is what happens to wages under a universal basic income. So by definition and quite explicitly, a lot of proponents say, well, we'll absolve employers from the responsibility of providing decent work at decent jobs. That's so old, that's so yesterday. You kind of absolve them of that responsibility. But at the same time, you potentially create a situation, especially the top-up kind of basic income approach that I've talked about as negative income tax. I mean, if an employer knows that if they cut the wages of a worker by $1, that worker's income benefit at the low end is going to go up by 50, 60, 70, 80 cents because the government's going to cut a bigger check, employers will figure out, well, why pay even close to a living wage? So I'd suggest that at a minimum, if you're going to provide a basic guaranteed income, you need to build it on a floor of legislated decent wages, a higher minimum wage. And we're kind of approaching that point now, at least at $15 an hour, or at least a single adult working full-time, full year at $15 an hour gets close to a living wage standard. And I think that's the appropriate point of emphasis in response to the growth of precarious and low-wage jobs, is rather than supplementing low wages, to at least make sure there's a decent floor to the job market. And I agree we should be ramping up the minimum wage standard over time and indexing at least to average wages. I guess I'll just flag it very quickly. I guess I would make the point, Jason was making it as well, that precarious work still is very much shaped by labour market institutions in different countries. So if we look at Denmark, the incidence of low-paid work, workers paid less than 2/3 of somebody bang in the middle. That compares to 21% in Canada, about 25% in the United States. So relatively strong unions, decent minimum wages do still quite make a difference. And I think the emphasis should be placed on improving those protective labour market institutions, and particularly the strength of the labour movement as opposed to income supplementation. So the other point I would make, and there's a bit of a flip side to Jason's statistics, which quite reasonably focused on the bottom third of the job market and what's going there. I think what's been characterizing our labor market due to technological change, the rise of the robots to the extent it's happened, is hollowed out a lot of middle income, what used to be middle class jobs. And that has pushed many workers who used to be in those kind of jobs into competition at the low end of the job market. So there's actually intense job competition for very low wage jobs. So, you know, when the governor of the Bank of Canada proclaims himself puzzled by why we have such low wage growth, why there's such low inflation at such a low, quote, a dramatically low unemployment rate of getting close to 6%. The reason is workers just, particularly at the bottom end of the job market, just have very little bargaining power. But it is still the case that there has been an expansion of the top third of the job market or so in terms of workers who have professional advanced educational qualifications. So the new economy is not totally a myth. There are quite a lot of good jobs being created. And there I think we need to sort of recall that a major part of what the labor movement was about, still is about to a degree, has been about expanding access to that base of core good jobs through shorter working time. And that really needs to be, so if we're going to, and it's still a big if, we're going to see the robots displacing workers from a lot of production, there still will be a core of good jobs, and we could share those good jobs by reducing and redistributing work time. So, you know, 5 minutes. So I'd remind you, actually in the 30s, during the New Deal, the early stages of the New Deal in the United States, the US Congress actually passed a bill in favor of a 4-day work week. It was actually imposed in a number of workplaces. Kellogg famously went on a 4-day work week. Unions pushed for it. Here in Canada, a big chemical company down in Sarnia went on a 4-day week. They worked their way through the 60s and 70s. But the idea was precisely at a time of unemployment, where only precarious jobs were available, to open up that core of good jobs to all. So I think that should be on our agenda as well. I guess the other point I'd make, and I'll try and wrap up quickly, is that you know, work is about more than income. And there's a long tradition, not just on the left, but this idea that, you know, somehow workers will be displaced from production, but they will just be fine on a universal cash payment just to enjoy free time. It kind of disavows a deep part of what it is for us to be human, because I know it's a lot of work is not what the ILO calls decent work, but we should be striving to improve work as a location for the development of skills and capacities where people work together in terms of a common social goal. So I won't bother you with quotes, but I've got nice counterposing quotes from Karl Marx and from Pope Francis, who's very, the Catholic tradition is very strong on the dignity of work, and we shouldn't be just pushing people out onto welfare and depriving them of active participation in society through work. So wrapping up very quickly, what should our priorities be? So I'll endorse your list. I would add to that list, I think there is a case for expanding the working income tax benefit that we now have, which is a very small income support payment that runs through the tax system. I think it's a maximum now of about $1,000, and you lose it at earnings of about $15,000. But there's been some scope for expanding that. So basically, the real problem, if you've got a decent minimum wage, the real problem is people who can only get part-time, part-year jobs, seasonal jobs, temporary jobs, of which there's a lot. And how do you bring them up to a decent standard of living? It's pretty hard to get an hourly wage. Even you get an hourly wage up to $20, $25 an hour, it's not going to take care of a lot of folks on low hours. So I think some income supplement is called for, given the prevalence of low wages. We need fundamental labor market reforms, labor law, employment standards law. Absolutely, I agree with. Employment insurance, there's a huge problem with people getting into the system at the bottom end. The government always likes to argue that 85% of people who are employed would qualify for EI if they were laid off. And the perfect system would be everybody who was employed would qualify for EI, but nobody who's actually unemployed qualifies because that costs money. But in fairness to the Liberals, they've dropped the threshold a bit on the new entrants, but so I think that's partially a solution to expand access to the EI system. But there again, if it benefits 55% of earnings and you're a low-wage worker and you're unemployed, it's not the answer in and of itself. I would increase the guaranteed income supplement for seniors. I would increase child benefits. But I think it's that suite of targeted programs, particularly aimed at the big gap in our income security system, which is the working age, working poor, that the priority should go, as opposed to the big bang solution of a universal basic income.
Okay, thank you so much for our two speakers. So now we will have a discussion. So this is a chance for you to ask your questions or perhaps share some of your thoughts. And we have some people who can run mics to you. For anyone who is interested, just make sure you raise your hand so we can see it. Okay, you go with this one.
Okay, well, this is for Andrew. I would disagree that the gaps are mainly just the working age, working poor. I think, in fact, the people who collect social assistance or who get disability payments are terribly disadvantaged by the current system, which regards them as almost subhumans, because for one reason or another they don't work. Can't work, or maybe don't want to work. Even I don't think there's something wrong with don't want to work. Both of my kids are in this kind of position of sort of being almost working class. One has fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, so he was on social assistance until he could finally prove that he really, couldn't hold down a job. In many ways, doesn't want to work because he's so paranoid about everything, so he's now on BC Persons with Disabilities getting $1,000 a month. I wouldn't say that the system has looked after his needs. And I would kind of argue then the reverse of what you do. You think that a basic income would suck up the notion of a need for daycare and for affordable housing and all that. Frankly, I think if there was a notion that the system was required to push everybody out of poverty, there would be an extreme incentive for governments to do things like provide daycare and provide affordable housing, because you don't want to increase the number of people who are being pushed into poverty, by all the market forces. So I really, I'm quite cold to everything you said, frankly. And one more thing I would add in terms of that is, the dolphin experiment that was, suppressed for many years, and then the evidence came out of it, did demonstrate that, in fact, that even that what amounted to a very low guaranteed annual income, which I wouldn't particularly support. But I knew people in Dauphin, I knew people in Winnipeg who were getting the income, and it was very reinforcing to them that they because just even if they couldn't find work, I mean, these are all people looking for work, but if they didn't find it, that they still weren't going to be completely desperate, and they weren't going to be forced to go on social assistance, which they didn't want to be on, even though in reality, the guaranteed annual income was actually the welfare rate. There was still this notion that somehow that then they were still getting something that everybody, would get. They didn't have to apply. Oh, and the other thing with that, social assistance versus disability, because, well, for example, in this province, you get almost twice as much if you're on AISH as if you're on social assistance. But frankly, it's almost the same population. The AISH people look worse. And the people on social assistance are not wanted in the workforce in various ways, but often, they're not really much different than people on AISH. So that's my little speech.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, well, I think it's good to have the debate. So I guess I didn't really have a chance to address income welfare reform, social assistance reform, and I certainly take to heart the argument that the rates, particularly for people who are unable to access the job market for a range of legitimate reasons, are deeply inadequate. So there's been a little bit of a move recently in Ontario to at least talking about increasing the rates after a long time, but I absolutely agree with that. I guess for those people who are able to work and want to work, I think the job opportunities that are available to them are usually very insecure and temporary and limited in hours. And we still do create this welfare wall that people on social assistance are reluctant to take a job which may only support them for a few weeks. And we should build into social assistance reform some kind of wage supplementation from social assistance so they're not losing any additional wage income dollar for dollar after a certain point. So if you define a basic income as some residual right to provide some basic level of well-being to people who are unable to work, I concur with that. And I mean, that ties in with, but I mean, I think still, why do you want to pay the benefit to everybody?
Well, you don't pay to everybody.
But well, if but if you're supporting a universal basic income, you are supporting a basic income provided by the state with no obligation, no work obligation to everybody. And I think that detracts from what we could and should be doing in terms of effective anti-poverty strategies. And in terms of disabilities, I mean, I'm far from being an expert, but last I engaged with the issue, I mean, there's an awful lot of people on disabilities who move in and out of disability status for a lot of reasons. And again, what you want is some program that kicks in extra income when they're not able to work. And that involves supports and services of all kinds. So, it's a question of sort of fiscal priorities, but I'm not sure we're opposed in terms of where we want to get at.
Okay, we'll just go on to the next question because I'm sure there's some follow-ups. We had the person in the purple shirt over here.
Mr. Jackson, you started by explaining that there are all different versions, a whole spectrum of basic income, and then you proceed to take the very most conservative to attack. So we talk about we talk about a principled basic income.
A what?
A principled basic income. Principles being not either or with a robust social support system, including childcare and including all of the pillars that Jason talked about in terms of labor legislation and workplace safety and minimum wage. It's not an either or. And that kind of divide and conquer that you're saying in terms of priorities is exactly what the right does in terms of scarcity. We haven't got enough. If we use a principled basic income, including looking after all of the people who do unpaid caring work in terms of no one going backwards from, say, a disability pension, recognizing all of the holes and the insecurity and the stress and the cost of increased health care, a whole system that is not working. Why is that have to be an either or? We do that or we do this. Why can't we do both with the resources that we have and the inequality that we have that needs to be redistributed? I fail to understand your either or when you're coming from,
Well,
as you have said, the same values.
I'd have to look at what your proposal, but like I say, if you pay every working age adult in Canada a basic income sufficient to put them at the poverty line, which is the gold standard of basic incomes, it's going to cost you about 20% of GDP. So Linda McQuaid last night talked about what we could do with 4% of GDP if we brought the tax rate back. But you're talking about an enormous expenditure. And you're putting everything on the income support side. So I'm not really on an either-or position because, I think we need to fix the labor market and we need to fix income security programs and improve them as well. But if I'm being a bit hard-edged, I take the point.
Okay, we'll go to our next question just in the back. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people raising your hands, so just a reminder that we do have lunch next. So there's plenty of time to talk with these two during lunch as well. So.
Great. My question was, in regards to automation. I think when we talk about labor as the first, we're talking about how it's about what can citizens exchange for their livelihood, essentially, if not their labor, right? Because I think we're moving into a time in which, unless you're talking about finance or technology, that average citizens don't have a lot to exchange for their labor. And I think that makes sense in regards to people with disabilities as well, whether that's depression or physical. So I guess what I'm wondering about is, like you're talking about your 5 pillars, is how do we kind of move the means of production back into the hands of citizens? Because I think that's really a lot of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's why, even though I only talked about it very briefly, I think that's why I talked about the 6th pillar, is that we have to build new institutions of labor, which make us less vulnerable to the decisions of capital. Automation will never take away, I think Andrew's point is a good one, that automation will never take away all the jobs. It just increases the competition for the jobs that are going to be left. And so we have to find other ways of generating forms of productive activity, in whatever form that looks like, that become less dependent upon the vagaries of capital. And that means, and whether that be, again, I don't want to, by listing the ideas of the options of them, I don't want to close off other possibilities that I'm not smart enough to have thought about. But worker co-ops can be very powerful if they can be more than just a tiny little niche of the economy. They're a tiny little minuscule portion of our economy. But if they become bigger, and Mondragon has its own complications, but when you start to see the possibilities of worker co-op models on a grander scale, you start to see possibilities of productive labor that isn't as dependent upon capital to be able to be productive. So I think that's why I talk about the importance of the 6th pillar. The labor movement's important. All the laws that and protections we've talked about are important, but we have to start thinking about new ways to be able to address these changes that keep coming at us.
So we'll go to our next question. Sorry, we'll go here. There. Just wait for the mic because we're trying to capture it right now.
Sorry. I have a comment and a question. The comment is like trying to link the discussion on basic income to a previous discussion on the LIB manifesto. The LIB manifesto does actually propose a basic income. It does not provide any details, and that I think that's why one of the reasons why many of us opposed voting on it as a whole, because basic income is a form of a cash transfer, and you have to look at the details of the cash transfer to see if it is something desirable or not, right? And I think that in that I agree with you. Like there is, we need to look at what is the math and what it is supposed to replace, right? There are cash transfers. For instance, what the Liberals did with the childcare is instead of providing childcare, they give a child benefit, right? So instead of providing a public service, they just replace that with money, and you decide what you want to do. But giving the money may not be better than providing the public service, right? And it would have been better for the Liberals to have provided actual childcare rather than just transfer the money. But because they in general don't believe in the effectiveness of public service, they didn't. So I think that it is important to look at the details, and I wanted to link that to the previous discussion about the LIB manifesto, because some people believe that the LIB manifesto was so progressive, and in many aspects, specifically in the basic income proposal, it was kind of a capitulation to neoliberalism. That was my comment. And then my question is, labor institutions are relatively cheap institutions, right? Like at the federal level, the OHS, the Occupational Health and Safety, and the labor standards, they cost like $10 million, which is not a lot of money. At the provincial level, they also cost like $10 million to do all that work. And here in Alberta, like the NDP government actually increased the funding for the labor department significantly in the first 2 years after they came into power. I wanted to ask you, like, how do you see those increases? Do you think that those were appropriate, that they addressed the specific issues, that they strengthened the institutions that we need to better control the labor market here? So that's my question.
Well, obviously the funding increases are positive. It's an important component to get more resources into the system, but the problem is the system's broken. There's a reason why enforcement of employment standards and occupational health and safety and so forth are inexpensive. It's because the way the system's been designed, it's been designed to be ineffective. And so while it's plausible and it's appropriate for them to have increased funding to those programs, it doesn't change the inherent flaws that are built within the way the system's structured. It's passive, it makes this assumption that workers are free agents who can advocate on their own interests as equal parties to their employer, which simply isn't true. And one of the reasons why the system's been designed to not work is because while they're not expensive, while they're not, big ticket items like guaranteed annual incomes, they do one thing that makes them very, very threatening if they're effective. They challenge employer control over the workplace. They sort of say to employers, you don't get to do that, and you have to do that, which employers, of course, are adamantly opposed to, and so spend a great deal of energy making sure the system is designed in such a fashion that it can create enough legitimation of the state, that it can actually legitimize the state, saying, look, we got occupational health and safety laws, we're making sure workers get home safe at the end of the day, but then they make sure that within that system there are enough built-in flaws that the system can't actually work the way we would like it to, the way it should have been intended to work, and as a result, it becomes ineffective at actually challenging employer control over the workplace.
Well done. Okay, we only have about just less than 5 minutes left, so we're just going to take a question over here. Yeah. I know, you both have your hands up. You just have your hand up, but we're going to And just try to keep your questions short, and just remember that they are still here for lunch.
Two short questions. $450 billion, you said it would cost for a guaranteed annual minimum income. And when I divide that by 20,000, I get 22,500,000 people on guaranteed income. Can you explain how you got to that conclusion that half of our population would be unguaranteed annual income.
Well,
And to Jason, I'd just like to know, give us a quick thought on international trade agreements.
Quick thought. Okay.
I thought you were going to expose an error in my math, but there's about 22 million people of working age, so I'm not counting kids and I'm not counting seniors in it, because a lot of seniors would be getting close to 20,000 from CPP or OAS. So you're right, you multiply 22 million by 20,000 a year, poverty line, you get $450 billion.
Do you want to do a quick comment on international?
I mean, but it's to bear this out, just to put it in context, the median or midpoint income for an individual in Canada, based on the last census data, is something like $35,000 a year. So if you're talking about a big transfer to a lot of people, it's going to cost a lot of money. That's just the math of it.
Yeah, a quick thought on international trade agreements. I mean, I think all I'll try and say, because all I know is before I know it, I'll be talking for 25 minutes, is they pose a significant challenge to the rebuilding of the traditional pillars. Because the traditional pillars were basically built on a model that capital was relatively immobile. And the more mobile capital gets, the harder it is to sustain those traditional institutions of the labor market. Which I guess then, to keep the comment short, is why and even though it's not particularly fleshed out, that need for new pillars, for new institutions that are able to respond more nimbly to the nature of globalized capital that has been manufactured through international trade agreements.
Okay, so fortunately or unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today. So if we could get another round of applause for our fantastic speakers.